An elderly mechanic was mocked for inheriting his late brother's dead repair shop, and 3 months later, his own name turned up on a patent that made the man who mocked him richer than he ever expected, and far less comfortable. Walter Krenshaw was 71 years old, and for 46 years he had been married to a woman who could tell, from the sound of his footsteps on the porch, whether the day had gone well or badly. Edith Krenshaw had learned this in the 2nd year of their marriage, when Walter came home from Boggs Tractor and Implements smelling like burnt clutch plate and said nothing for an hour, and she had known something was wrong before he ever opened his mouth. 44 years later, the sound of his footsteps had changed. They were slower now, and uneven on the left side, the cane finding the boards before his foot did. But Edith could still read him. She had been reading him since 1980. Edith herself had taught 2nd grade at Pawnee Elementary for 19 years before retiring in 2011. Long enough to have once had Sully Tate as a student. Long enough to recognize, in the particular way grown men still sometimes flinched at a teacher's direct question, exactly which of them had sat in her classroom decades earlier. She had married Walter in 1980 after meeting him when her own father's truck wouldn't start outside the Pawnee Co-op. And Walter, 25 years old and still 3 years from opening his own shop, had fixed it in the parking lot in under 20 minutes without being asked twice. She liked to say, when anyone asked how they met, that she married him for his hands before she knew anything else about him, and that nothing in 46 years had given her reason to revise the decision. Walter had spent 38 years as a mechanic, not a parts changer. A mechanic in the old sense, the kind who could listen to an engine through a length of broom handle pressed to his ear and tell you which cylinder was misfiring before he opened the hood. He had worked at Boggs for 11 years, then opened his own shop, Krenshaw Auto and Machine, on the edge of Pawnee, Oklahoma, in 1986. He ran it for 31 years. In that time, he trained 4 apprentices, rebuilt some 600 engines by his own count, written in a ledger he still kept in the hall closet, and developed a reputation across 3 counties for being the man who fixed things other shops sent away. He was, by any honest measure, a craftsman in a trade most of the country had stopped respecting somewhere around the time computers started running engine diagnostics, and Walter had watched that shift happen across 3 decades with the patient. Unbothered clarity of a man who had decided early that being underestimated by people who didn't understand the work was simply part of the job. Customers sometimes mistook his slow, deliberate manner for slowness of mind, especially the ones from Tulsa or Oklahoma City who pulled off the highway with a problem a dealership had already failed to solve, and Walter let them mistake it. Because the mistake usually lasted exactly as long as it took him to diagnose in 4 minutes what the dealership had spent 2 days and $600 failing to find. He had also, in 1994, built something. A torque-limiting socket adapter, machined out of a chunk of 4140 chromoly steel he'd bought off a scrap dealer in Stillwater, designed to keep a wrench from over-torquing a head bolt on the diesel trucks that kept coming through with stripped threads. He built it over a single weekend, in the back of the shop, after a farmer named Earl Vance brought in his 3rd stripped head bolt in 2 years, and asked Walter, half joking, why nobody had built a tool that simply wouldn't let a man over-tighten the thing in the first place. Walter had thought about that question for exactly 4 days before he had an answer machined and bolted to his own lift. He welded a mounting bracket for it into the side rail of his own lift, where it lived for the next 23 years, used almost daily, never patented, never sold, never thought about as anything other than a tool he'd made, because the tool he needed didn't exist yet. Earl Vance never stripped another bolt. Walter never charged him anything extra for it, and never thought to ask whether anyone else might want one. Then, on a Tuesday in March, 14 months before this story begins, Walter had a stroke while closing up the shop. He was found by Edith 40 minutes later, on the concrete floor near the parts counter, his left hand curled against his chest like he was protecting something. He survived it. The hand did not fully come back. 3 fingers worked, the other 2 curled, and would not be told otherwise. He had not held a wrench with that hand since. The shop closed the week after. Walter was 70 years old and could not return to work that required 2 functioning hands at speed, and there was no one to take it over. His own son had moved to Denver in 2009 and had no interest in steel and grease, so Krenshaw Auto and Machine sat locked, the lift frozen mid-air with a 2006 Silverado still on it. Weeds finding their way up through the cracked concrete of the front bay for 14 months. Walter's older brother, Harold Krenshaw, had quietly held the deed to the shop's land since 1986. A courtesy arrangement from when Walter didn't have the credit to buy it outright himself. The kind of thing brothers did for each other without ever writing it down as anything but family. Harold had also, without telling Walter, filed a provisional patent application in 2009 for a torque-limiting fastener engagement device. Based on sketches Walter had shown him over coffee one Sunday, sketches Walter had made for fun, never imagining anyone would file paper on them. Harold had been a retired patent examiner himself, fussy about that sort of thing. The kind of man who filed paperwork the way other men collected stamps. He never told Walter he'd done it. He never told anyone. He died of a heart attack in November, 4 months before this story begins, and the patent, along with the deed to the shop property, passed into his estate. Harold's only child was Dean Krenshaw, 39, a commercial leasing broker in Tulsa with a business card that said Senior Vice President, Krell Commercial Properties, and a haircut that cost more than Walter's monthly Social Security check. Dean had not set foot in Pawnee in 6 years. He came back for the funeral, stayed at the Holiday Inn Express off Highway 64 rather than his father's house, and was gone again within 48 hours. The estate handed to a probate attorney with instructions to liquidate everything that wasn't cash. The will reading happened on a Thursday morning at the law office of Marsh and Tilden, on the 2nd floor above the old Pawnee Hardware building, up a narrow staircase that gave Walter trouble even before the hip started acting up. Walter and Edith arrived at 9:15 for a 9 o'clock appointment, because Walter's hip had started giving him trouble that winter too, and the attorney, a heavyset man named Roy Tilden, who had handled half the estates in the county for the last 20 years, did not seem surprised by the lateness or by much else. The office smelled of old carpet and the particular institutional coffee that law offices in small towns always seemed to keep brewing, and a single-window unit air conditioner rattled in the frame behind Tilden's desk, fighting a losing battle against the May heat already building outside. Dean was already there, in a charcoal suit that had clearly never seen the inside of a Pawnee dry cleaner, scrolling through his phone in the chair nearest the door. One polished shoe crossed over his knee. The reading took 11 minutes. Harold's house and its contents went to Dean, along with a brokerage account worth $340,000 and a 2021 Lexus still under factory warranty. The shop property, the half-acre lot, the cinderblock building, and everything inside it went to Walter. Tilden read the line twice because Dean asked him to, his pen tapping once against the desk blotter each time. To my brother Walter, the shop and the land beneath it, and whatever he finds worth keeping inside. Dean had laughed. Not cruelly, not loudly, but the kind of laugh a man makes when he has already decided something is a joke and is relieved to have it confirmed. A short exhale through the nose more than an actual sound. "Dad gave you the junk pile," he said. "Sorry, Uncle Walt." Looks like he wanted you to inherit your own old equipment. He said it warmly enough, the way a man says something he believes is kind. I mean, no offense, but that lot's probably worth $8,000–9,000 for the land, if that. The building's condemnable. I had a guy look at comps on Crawford Street last year for a client. He had looked at Walter's hand, the curled one, resting on his cane, and something in his expression had softened in a way that felt almost like care and almost like pity, and Walter had not been able to tell the two apart, which was its own kind of wound. You should let me list it. I can move dead commercial property. It's literally my job. Walter had said, I appreciate that, Dean. I think we'll hold on to it for now. It's a tear down, Uncle Walt. Dean had said this gently, leaning forward slightly in his chair, the gentleness of a man who believed he was being patient with someone who didn't understand the market. I'm not trying to push you. I just don't want you and Aunt Edith sitting on a liability. There's liability insurance issues with a vacant commercial building. If a kid gets in there and falls through the floor, that's on you now. We'll think about it, Edith had said, in the voice she used when a conversation was over, the voice 19 years of second graders had taught her to deploy without raising her volume at all. Roy Tilden, for his part, said nothing during any of this exchange, his pen still resting on the will. And if he noticed anything unusual in how quickly Dean had moved to characterize his uncle's inheritance, he gave no sign of it. Though Edith would think back on his silence more than once in the months that followed, and wonder exactly how much an estate attorney of 20 years standing chooses not to say out loud in a room. Tilden had in fact prepared the codicil himself 8 months earlier at Harold's specific instruction, typed it twice to get the language exactly right at Harold's insistence, and had sat through this entire reading knowing precisely what the shop actually contained in legal terms, a fact he was under no professional obligation to volunteer, and did not. In the truck afterward, Walter had sat with both hands on his knees, the good one and the curled one, and said nothing for the 11 minutes it took to drive home, the same length of time, Edith noted without saying so, as the reading itself, the irony of it not escaping her even as she kept her own counsel about it. Edith did not fill the silence. She had learned, across 46 years, when silence was Walter doing the work he needed to do. And this was clearly that kind of silence. That night, Walter went looking for the only copy of the shop key, which he found in the bottom of his sock drawer, where it had been since the lockup 14 months earlier. He held it under the kitchen light for a long moment. Edith watched him from the doorway. You're not selling it, she said. It wasn't a question. No, Walter said. I don't think I am. Dean's not wrong that it's falling apart. No, Walter agreed. He's not wrong about that. So what is it you're after? Walter turned the key over once in his palm. I don't rightly know yet, he said. But Harold didn't leave things to chance. 40 years I knew that man, and he never once did anything without a reason he'd already worked out twice. He set the key on the counter. I want to go look. They drove out the next morning. The shop sat on the edge of town where Highway 18 curved south, a low cinder-block building with 2 bay doors and a flat roof that had been patched so many times the patches had patches. The Krenshaw Auto and Machine sign, hand-painted by Walter himself in 1986, hung at an angle from one remaining bolt, the red paint sun bleached to the color of old brick. Johnson grass had come up through the cracks in the front apron in dense green clumps, knee-high in places. The padlock on the east bay door had rusted to the color of dried blood. A black plastic feed sack had blown against the chain link and stayed there long enough to bleach pale gray. Walter stood at the gate for a moment before he unlocked it. Edith stood beside him, not speaking. Then he went in. The inside smelled like motor oil gone old and stale dust, and underneath that, faintly, of the cherry pipe tobacco Walter had quietly given up the year of his stroke, but whose smell had soaked into the walls over 3 decades and never fully left. The 2006 Silverado was still up on the lift where it had been the day Walter collapsed. Front end raised, a half-finished brake job frozen in time, tools laid out on the rolling cart in the order Walter had left them. Because nobody had touched anything in 14 months. A calendar from the year of the stroke still hung on the wall by the parts counter, open to March. A county fair date circled in red pen that had long since passed. The parts counter itself was layered in a fine gray film. But underneath the dust, Walter could see his own handwriting on yellowed invoice slips still clipped to a spike. Names of customers, dates, the prices he'd charged, the small economy of a working life laid out in his own hand. He walked the bay slowly, his cane finding the uneven concrete, and cataloged what he was seeing the way he had cataloged engines for 38 years, looking for what didn't belong. The compressor in the corner, dead, needle stuck at 0. The parts shelves, mostly empty, a few boxes of gaskets gone brittle. The cardboard soft at the corners where moisture had wicked up from the floor. A coffee mug on the windowsill still held a half-inch of coffee gone to black tar, the same mug Walter had been drinking from the morning of the stroke, with Pawnee Effa 1987 fading on its side, a mug his son had won at a county auction as a teenager and given to him as a joke that had outlasted the joke by 3 decades. The radio on the shelf above the bench was still tuned to KGFF, 1450 AM, the dial frozen where Walter had left it, though the batteries had long since died. He moved along the south wall, where a row of pegboard hooks still held wrenches in size order, 3 sockets missing from the set because Walter had loaned them to a man named Curtis Boudreau in 2015, and never gotten them back. A debt Walter remembered with the same clarity he remembered most debts, financial and otherwise. Above the pegboard, a faded photograph, taped rather than framed, showed Walter's first apprentice class from 1989. 4 young men in coveralls squinting into the Oklahoma sun, 3 of whom Walter could still name without hesitation. The 4th had died in a combine accident in 2003, and Walter had gone to that funeral the way he went to all of them, in the one good suit he owned, sitting in the back. The hydraulic lift itself, the one he'd bought used in 1991 and rebuilt twice, its steel rails painted the dull gray green he'd chosen because it was the cheapest color at the supply store that year, sat with the Silverado raised exactly as he'd left it, the safety locks still engaged. A small mercy of the design that meant nothing had shifted or fallen in 14 months of standing empty. Walter ran his good hand along the rail as he passed it, the way another man might run a hand along a horse's flank, an old habit of checking for things that didn't feel right under his palm, and bolted to the side rail of that lift, where it had lived since 1994, the torque-limiting socket adapter. Walter stopped in front of it. He had not thought about that piece of steel in 14 months. He reached out with his good hand and turned it slowly on its mount, the way he'd turned it 10,000 times before, the mechanism still smooth, still true. "Well," he said quietly, mostly to himself, "still here. What is it?" Edith asked. "Something I made," Walter said, "long time ago. Kept the bolts on those diesel heads from stripping." He turned it again, saved me I don't know how many comebacks. Edith looked at the rust, the dust, the dead compressor, the calendar frozen in March. "Harold knew this was here," she said. It wasn't a question either. "Harold knew everything," Walter said. "Man filed his taxes 9 months early every year of his life. He didn't leave me a junk pile by accident." He looked at the curled fingers of his left hand, then back at the socket adapter. I don't know what he was thinking, but I know he was thinking something. They went through the shop for 3 more hours that first visit, Walter directing with his good hand and his voice, while Edith did the lifting his hand could no longer do. Pulling drawers, opening the metal filing cabinet in the back office that still held 31 years of invoices, parts catalogs, and a coffee can of loose nuts and washers that Walter had been meaning to sort since 1997. They found Harold's handwriting twice, once on a note tucked into an old invoice book, dated 2009, that read only W, keep records on the bracket mod, just in case, and once on the back of a photograph of the two brothers standing in front of the shop the week it opened in 1986, where Harold had written, in his small, precise hand, the smart one. Edith found that second one. She didn't say anything about it. She just set it on the parts counter where Walter would see it when he turned around, and went back to clearing a shelf. Sully Tate showed up on the 4th day, driving an F-250 with his own shop's name on the door. Tate Diesel and Diagnostics, out on the Stillwater Road, and parked outside the chain link without being asked. Sully was 52, had apprenticed under Walter from 1998 to 2003, and had heard from his cousin's wife, who worked the front desk at Marsh & Tilden, that Walter Krenshaw was out at the old shop most days now. Sully had not called ahead. He had simply come, the way he used to come when he was 19 years old, and needed Walter to look at a transmission he couldn't figure. Back when Sully had been a wiry, restless kid nobody else in town would hire because he'd dropped out of Votech twice, and Walter had taken him on anyway after watching him diagnose a dead battery in a customer's truck correctly while waiting in the lobby for an oil change. Sully had never forgotten that Walter hired him on the strength of a guess that turned out right, and the debt of that, 25 years on, had never fully settled in his mind. "Heard you got the place back," Sully said, standing at the gate, his cap pushed back on his head, sizing up the lot the way he sized up an engine bay, methodically, left to right. "Got it back's one way to put it," Walter said. Sully looked past him at the bay doors standing open, the Silverado still on the lift. "You gonna fix that truck?" "Don't know yet what I'm gonna do." Sully nodded slowly, the way men do when they understand more than they're saying. "I got a torque wrench setup giving me fits on those new Cummins heads," he said. "Keep stripping out before I hit spec." "You remember that thing you built? The limiter?" Walter looked at him for a long moment. "I remember it. I've been telling guys about that thing for 15 years, Sully said. "Half of them think I'm making it up." That was the first afternoon Walter let someone other than Edith into the bay with him, and the first time in 14 months that Walter Krenshaw used a tool with his good hand while another man watched and learned, the way it had been for 38 years before the stroke took half his grip away. Sully held the socket adapter steady on the bench, while Walter explained, slowly, with the patience of a man who had trained 4 apprentices and never once raised his voice doing it, exactly how the limiting mechanism worked, why the spring tension mattered, why he'd machined the collar the way he had instead of the simpler way most men would have tried first. "You ever think about making more of these?" Sully asked. "Made one," Walter said. "Worked fine, didn't need 2. "I'd buy one," Sully said. Today, Cash Walter didn't answer that directly. But that night, at the kitchen table, he got out a yellow legal pad and, with his good hand, began sketching the adapter from memory, dimension by dimension, the way he remembered it, the way Harold had once watched him sketch the same thing on a napkin 17 years earlier. Dean called on a Saturday, 11 days after the will reading. Walter answered the kitchen phone because Edith was in the garden. Dean's voice had the easy warmth of a man checking a box. "Hey, Uncle Walt, just following up. Did you get a chance to think more on the shop?" "I've got a buyer, actually, a guy who does self-storage conversions. He's looking at that whole stretch of 18. He'd probably go 10, 11,000 for the lot if we move quick, before he finds something else." "We're using it," Walter said. There was a pause on the line. "Using it? How?" "Working on something, Uncle Walt." Dean's voice took on the particular gentleness of a man explaining a thing he believed was obvious. "I love that you've got a project. I do. But you had a stroke 14 months ago. No offense, but that building's not insured for anybody to be in it. The roof's questionable. And Aunt Edith can't be hauling steel around at her age either. I'm trying to look out for you here. Dad would have wanted me looking out for you." "I expect he would," Walter said. "I think this is what he had in mind." Dean laughed, the same warm, certain laugh from the law office. "Uncle Walt, with respect, Dad left you a shop because it was the one piece of property nobody else in the family wanted. It wasn't a strategy. It was the leftover. A beat. I'm not trying to be unkind. I just don't want you putting money into something that's worth less than what you'd spend fixing the roof." "I appreciate you looking out," Walter said. "We'll let you know if we change our minds." He hung up before Dean could say anything else. Edith came in from the garden a few minutes later, dirt still on her knees, and found Walter sitting at the table with the legal pad, 3 new sketches added since morning. "Dean called," she said. It wasn't a question. "Dean called. You still think it's a junk pile?" "He thinks he's being kind," Walter said. "I believe he believes that." He turned the legal pad so she could see the sketches. "Doesn't change what I think I'm looking at." Dean called again 2 weeks after that, this time with the storage conversion buyer's name and a number, $11,500, firm, his client's best and final, the kind of offer Dean clearly expected would settle the matter on its own. Walter let him finish the pitch all the way through. The lot size, the closing timeline, the property taxes Dean noted would only keep climbing on a building doing nothing. Dean's voice picking up the particular cadence of a man who has rehearsed a pitch enough times that he no longer hears himself rehearsing it. Then Walter said, "We're not selling, Dean," in the same flat voice he used to tell a customer a transmission was beyond saving. And Dean, audibly surprised that the number hadn't moved anything, said, "Okay, okay. Uncle Walt, I just don't want you holding on to something out of sentiment that's costing you money every year it sits." "It's not sitting," Walter said, and left it there, and did not explain the 11 collars on the shelf, or the running mill, or any of it. Because some things a man only explains once, and Walter had decided he would rather Dean see it than be told. He hung up the phone that evening and stood for a moment at the kitchen window, looking out at the dark, thinking not of Dean exactly, but of his brother. Of the particular satisfaction Harold had always taken in being 3 steps ahead of a problem nobody else had noticed yet, and wondering, not for the first time that month, exactly how many of those 3 steps Harold had already walked on his behalf before he ever knew there was a path to walk. What Walter Krenshaw could not have known yet, and would not learn until the 4th week, was that his brother Harold retired after 31 years as a federal patent examiner. A man who had spent his entire working life reading other men's inventions and deciding whether they were real, had filed a provisional patent application in March of 2009, titled Torque Limiting Fastener Engagement Device, listing Walter Krenshaw as sole inventor, based on the sketches Walter had shown him at a Sunday breakfast that Walter barely remembered. A breakfast that had otherwise been notable only for an argument about whether the Thunder would make the playoffs that year. Harold had let the provisional lapse into a full utility application within the year, quietly, paying the fees himself out of his own retirement account, never mentioning it to Walter because Harold knew his brother well enough to know that if he'd asked permission, Walter would have said it wasn't worth the trouble. The patent had been granted in 2011. It had sat, unlicensed and unused, attached to nothing but a filing number and Harold's quiet conviction that someday it would matter. For 13 years, it was now an asset of Harold's estate. And because Harold had also, in a codicil dated 8 months before his death, specified that any patents, intellectual property, or inventions developed by or attributed to my brother Walter Krenshaw shall pass directly to Walter Krenshaw regardless of any other distribution made in this will, the patent itself, separate from the shop, separate from the land, a piece of paper nobody in the room at Marsh and Tilden had thought to mention, because nobody but Roy Tilden's paralegal had actually read the full codicil, already belonged to Walter. It had belonged to him since the day the will was read. Dean did not know it existed. Dean, meanwhile, was already telling people it existed in a different sense. At a dinner in Tulsa 2 weeks after the funeral, talking to a colleague at Krell Commercial about his father's estate, Dean had mentioned, almost in passing, that his father held some old patent or something, from way back, never made a dime off it, probably worthless, and that he was planning to let it lapse rather than pay the maintenance fees, since nobody could even say what it was for anymore. He said this confidently, the way a man says something he has decided is true without checking. The same confidence he brought to every commercial valuation he'd made. In 14 years of brokering property, he'd never have to live with the consequences of misjudging. He had pulled the patent number off an old folder in his father's filing cabinet and asked his assistant to look into the maintenance status, mostly out of idle curiosity about whether there was anything to monetize before he closed out the estate. The assistant had come back 2 days later with the answer that maintenance fees were current, paid in advance through next year by the deceased, and that the listed inventor was not Harold Krenshaw at all, but a Walter Krenshaw of Pawnee, Oklahoma. Dean had filed that information away without much thought. He had other things on his mind that week. A closing on a shopping center outparcel that mattered more to his commission than anything left behind by an uncle he saw twice a decade. He did not connect it to the uncle he had visited 11 days earlier. Sitting in a law office with a cane and a curled left hand, the uncle he had decided, without much examination, was a kind old man sitting on a worthless lot. If you've made it this far into Walter Crenshaw's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. By the second month, the bay at Krenshaw Auto and Machine had power again. Sully had brought over a portable generator the first week, and, by the third week, had quietly arranged for the electric company to reconnect service to the building, paying the deposit himself, and telling Walter it was back-billed from before. A small lie that Walter chose not to investigate too closely. Walter could not climb under a vehicle anymore, could not grip a ratchet with the speed and certainty he once had, but he could direct. He could diagnose by ear and by the particular pattern of wear on a part. And he could machine. The old Bridgeport mill in the back corner, untouched since the stroke, still ran true once Sully helped clean the ways and re-oil the table gears. Though it took the two of them the better part of a Saturday to free the table feed screw, frozen with 14 months of dried cutting oil turned to varnish. Walter began making the adapters properly, this time with drawings instead of memory. He spent the first week of real work not at the lathe, but at the kitchen table, redrawing the original 1994 design from scratch on graph paper, correcting 2 tolerances he'd never been fully satisfied with the first time, narrowing the collar by 0.03 of an inch after deciding, 30 years late, that the original fit had always run slightly looser than he liked. Edith watched him erase the same line 4 times one evening and said nothing, just refilled his coffee and let him work it out. Sully cut the first piece of stock on a Tuesday in early April, a length of 4140 chromoly steel ordered from a supplier in Oklahoma City because the original scrap dealer in Stillwater had closed in 2008. The bar arrived bent very slightly, not enough to reject. but enough that Walter made Sully true it on the lathe before they cut a single piece off it. A half-day lost to a problem that wouldn't have shown on a part this small, but that Walter wasn't willing to build a reputation on twice. "Measure it like it matters," Walter said. The same thing he'd said to 4 apprentices over 31 years. Because it does. Even when it doesn't look like it does. The first finished collar came off the lathe on April the 9th, and it was wrong. Sully had set the compound rest at the angle from Walter's old notes, written in 1994 in pencil, that had faded to almost nothing, and misread a 6 for an 8. The taper came out too steep, and the collar wouldn't seat against the limiter spring the way it needed to. Walter held it up to the shop light for a long moment, turning it in his good hand, and said only, "Well, now we know the pencil lied to us once." They scrapped it into the steel bin, and Sully cut a second piece, and this time Walter stood at his shoulder the whole pass, calling out the depth of cut in tenths, his voice flat and patient the way it had been with every apprentice he'd ever trained. The second collar fit. Walter mounted it against the original 1994 adapter, still bolted to the lift rail where it had lived for 30 years, and turned both side by side under the light, checking the engagement by feel since his left hand still couldn't manage the fine caliper's work. "There," he said. "That's the one." They finished 4 collars that first week, 6 the second. The work slow, because Walter insisted on inspecting every piece himself before it left the bench, holding each one against the drawing taped to the wall, checking the stamped serial number against the ledger Edith now kept at the kitchen table each night. By the 3rd week of April, the shelf behind the workbench, empty for 14 months, held its first row of finished parts. The roof came next, because the spring rains had started, and a leak over the parts counter had been dripping steadily onto the same spot for years, long enough to rot a section of the plywood decking beneath the shingles. Sully knew a roofer, a man named Pruitt, who owed him a favor from a transmission job the year before, and Pruitt came out on a Saturday with 2 of his sons and patched the section properly, tar paper and new shingles, while Walter sat in a folding chair in the shade and directed where the old flashing needed replacing, a detail Pruitt's sons would have missed without him. Walter paid Pruitt in cash from the coffee can of loose change and bills Edith had started keeping in the office drawer. $400, the first real expense of the rebuild, and wrote it in the ledger himself that night with his good hand, the handwriting slower than it used to be but still his own. May brought the first outside customer, a man named Royce Dunnigan, who farmed 4 sections south of town and had heard from Sully's cousin's wife that Crenshaw's was running again. Royce came in with a 2014 Ford with a stripped head bolt on the number 6 cylinder, the exact problem Walter's original limiter had been built to prevent, and stood in the bay with his hat in his hands while Walter explained, slowly, that the shop wasn't quite ready to take on full engine work yet, not with his hand the way it was, but that Sully could do it under his direction if Royce didn't mind the wait. Royce didn't mind. He came back 3 days later to pick up the truck, ran his thumb over the new torque limited bolt, and asked if Walter sold the tool itself. That was the first sale that wasn't to Sully or a curiosity. Collar number 7, sold for $60 cash, the first dollar the shop had earned since the stroke. June brought the heat, the kind of Oklahoma June that turned the cinder block walls warm to the touch by mid-morning, and with it came the first real setback. The Bridgeport spindle bearing, original to the machine and original to 1986, began to chatter under load, a high thin whine that told Walter exactly what was wrong before he ever opened the headstock. A new bearing set would run $380 and take 10 days to ship from a supplier in Tulsa. Walter sat with the ledger that night and looked at what was left in the account. $1,140. most of it from the $60 sale, and a small loan Edith had quietly taken against her teacher's pension without telling Walter until the bearing came up, and decided to wait the 10 days rather than rush a part that mattered. Sully kept the lathe running in the meantime, finishing collars by hand feed on a machine that wasn't built for it. Slower, but steady. By July, 11 collars sat on the shelf, each stamped, each logged, and Sully had started bringing his own overflow diesel work into the bay on the days his shop in Stillwater was slow, splitting the floor space the way the two of them had split a workbench 25 years earlier, when Sully was 19 and didn't yet trust his own hands. Walter's grip in the curled fingers had not improved. The doctor had told him in March it likely never would. But he had found, by July, that he no longer reached for them out of habit, and was surprised each time by the reaching. He had adapted instead. He had learned to hold a part steady against his chest with his forearm, while his good hand worked the file. A trick no apprentice had ever taught him, because no apprentice had needed it. A trick he was inventing for himself at 71, the same patient way he'd invented the limiter at 41. Edith, through all of it, kept the books, kept the coffee coming, and kept a second list going in the back of the ledger that she didn't show Walter until August. A list of every name Sully or Royce or the handful of other customers had mentioned. Men across 3 counties who'd want a limiter once they heard one existed. 41 names by the time she showed him. "That's not a hobby anymore, Walter," she said. "That's a list." August brought heat that made the cinder block walls feel like the inside of a kiln by 2 in the afternoon, and it brought, with it, the second real setback of the rebuild. A man named Dale Pruitt's nephew, 18 years old and working his uncle's roofing crew for the summer, had mentioned the limiter to a foreman on a county road crew, who mentioned it to a parts buyer at a farm equipment dealership in Stillwater, who called Krenshaw Auto and Machine directly and asked, bluntly, whether Walter intended to manufacture the part at any real volume, because the dealership moved enough diesel trucks through its service bay to want 20 units a month if the price was right. It was the kind of call Walter had no idea how to answer. He had built 1 tool in 1994 and 12 more across a single summer, by hand, on a 38-year-old Bridgeport mill that needed its bearings replaced twice already that year. 20 units a month was a different kind of shop entirely, and Walter told the buyer, honestly, that he'd need to think on it, and hung up the phone and sat for a long time at the workbench with his good hand pressed flat against the steel surface. "You're not equipped for that," Sully said, when Walter told him. It wasn't a question either. Not on this mill. Not with 2 of us. "No," Walter agreed. "So, what do we tell him?" Walter looked around the bay, the shelf of stamped collars, the Bridgeport with its rebuilt bearings, the lift with the original 1994 adapter still bolted where it had lived for 30 years. "We tell him the truth," Walter said, "that we're not there yet, and we ask him to wait." The dealership buyer waited. He placed a standing order for 6 units a month starting in September, which was within what the shop could manage, and told Sully, almost as an afterthought, that he'd been hearing the name Krenshaw mentioned by men who'd never set foot in the shop. Men 3 counties over who knew the limiter by reputation alone, the way Walter's own reputation had spread 30 years earlier, 1 satisfied customer at a time, with no advertising beyond the work itself holding up. By September, the shop had become something other than a project Walter and Sully worked alone. A retired machinist named Glenn Fask, 83 years old and bored since his wife's death the year before, started showing up most Wednesdays, ostensibly to look at old equipment, in practice to run the second lathe Sully had hauled over from his own shop, freeing Walter to do the close tolerance inspection work that mattered most. Glenn had spent 30 years machining aircraft parts in Tulsa before retiring, and he and Walter discovered, within their first hour working side by side, that they had crossed paths once in 1991 at a tooling supplier's counter, and had each, separately, remembered the other man's name for over 3 decades without either of them realizing it until Glenn mentioned the date out loud. Royce Dunnigan's teenage grandson came by twice that month to watch, the way teenagers do when they've decided something is more interesting than they're willing to admit out loud, and Walter let him sweep the floor, and, eventually, DeBurr finished collars with a file. The same first task Walter had given every apprentice he'd ever trained, going back to 1989. The first frost came in late September, and with it the first real cold mornings in the bay, the cinder block holding the chill the same way it had held the summer heat, and Walter started coming in earlier, before Edith was even fully awake, just to have the shop to himself for 20 minutes before Sully arrived, the lights off, the bay doors still closed, sitting on the stool at the workbench in the gray early light with his coffee, the way he used to before the stroke took the routine away from him for 14 months. He had not realized, until he had it back, how much of himself had been built in to that 20 minutes of quiet. Edith kept the books. She had never kept books for the shop when Walter ran it the first time. That had been Walter's domain, late at night with the ledger and a cup of coffee. But she took to it now with the same patience she'd used raising their son, and, before that, teaching second grade for 19 years in the Pawnee school system. She wrote down every dollar Sully spent on stock steel, every hour Walter spent at the bench, and on a Tuesday in the 3rd week, she sat Walter down at the kitchen table and said, "Sully thinks you should sell these. Sully thinks a lot of things. He's not wrong this time." Edith pushed a piece of paper across the table, a list, in her handwriting, of every diesel mechanic in a 60-mile radius Sully had mentioned by name as men who'd asked about the limiter over the years. 11 names. That's 11 men he can think of off the top of his head, in one county, who've heard about a tool you built and never sold. How many counties are there in Oklahoma with a diesel shop in them? Walter looked at the list for a long time. "I don't know the first thing about selling something like this." "No," Edith agreed. But Harold did. Man spent 31 years deciding what was worth patenting and what wasn't. "You think he filed that paper because he liked you?" Walter went still. "What paper?" It was Edith who found it, 3 days later, going through the last unopened box from Harold's house. A box of old files Dean's assistant had shipped to Pawnee without much interest, because it was labeled, in Harold's hand, K, Patent, MISC, and nobody at Krell Commercial had thought a box with that label was worth Dean's personal attention. She had spent the better part of an afternoon at the kitchen table working through it, setting aside tax returns and warranty cards and the small, useless paper accumulation of a careful man's life, until she reached, near the bottom, a manila folder containing the full prosecution history of U.S. Patent 7XXXXX, granted 2011, torque limiting fastener engagement device, inventor Walter J. Krenshaw. Attached to the front of the folder, paper-clipped, was a single index card in Harold's small, precise handwriting. "He'll say he doesn't want the trouble. Make him take it anyway." Walter read the card 4 times before he set it down. "He knew," Walter said. "All this time, he knew exactly what he was leaving me." "He didn't leave you a junk pile," Edith said. "He left you the one thing Dean didn't know how to read." She did not let the folder sit overnight. She had taught second grade for 19 years, long enough to know that a thing left for tomorrow had a way of becoming a thing left forever. And she sat at the kitchen table that same evening and made a list of every patent attorney within 100 miles, narrowing it by phone the next morning to a woman in Oklahoma City named Pam Ostrowski, chosen mostly because Pam's secretary had been the only one of 6 offices to ask, unprompted, whether the patent was still being maintained, a question Edith took as a good sign about how the woman thought. Walter called Pam Ostrowski the next morning, a woman who had handled IP licensing for 2 decades and who, after reviewing the file Edith had photographed page by page on her phone and emailed that same afternoon, called back within 4 days to say that a granted, currently maintained utility patent on a torque limiting fastener mechanism with no prior licensing and a working prototype already in field use was not a curiosity. It was, in her words, a real asset, and depending on who wants it, possibly a significant one, especially given that 2 of the larger diesel fastener manufacturers had, in the years since 2011, released competing products that walked uncomfortably close to the claims language Harold had drafted with a patent examiner's precision. She asked Walter to send her everything Solly and Royce had said about the limiter, every name on Edith's growing list, because, she told him, infringement cases get a lot easier to prove when half a county already knows the tool exists and knows exactly who built it first. Walter hung up the phone that evening and sat for a long while at the kitchen table without speaking, the curled fingers of his left hand resting against the wood, while Edith watched him from the stove. 46 years, he said finally, and I still don't know everything you're capable of deciding on your own. Edith didn't look up from the pot she was stirring. Good, she said. Keeps it interesting. Pam Ostrowski called back 2 days later with a more complete picture, having spent the interim pulling the file histories of both manufacturers whose products she suspected walked too close to Harold's claims language. One of them, the Indiana company, had filed its own competing patent application in 2016, 5 years after Walter's had been granted, and Pam said, with the dry satisfaction of an attorney who enjoys a clean case, that a junior examiner had apparently missed the prior art entirely, which was either an oversight that would embarrass someone or an opportunity that would enrich someone, depending entirely on what Walter decided to do about it. Walter listened to all of this from the kitchen phone, the curled fingers of his left hand resting flat against the counter, and said only that he'd let her handle whichever one it turned out to be. Because reading patent law had never been his trade, and he saw no reason to start learning it badly at 71 when there was a woman in Oklahoma City who'd already spent 20 years learning it well. Dean found out about the renewed activity on the patent the way he found out about most things that didn't directly involve him. Through someone else's mistake. His assistant, doing routine due diligence on the estate's remaining intangible assets before the final accounting, ran a status check on patent 7XXXXXX and discovered that an attorney named Pam Ostrowski had filed a request for the complete file history 4 days earlier on behalf of Walter J. Krenshaw. Dean read the email twice in his office on the 11th floor of the Krell Commercial Building, the city spread out gray and flat below him, and felt something shift that he could not immediately name. He had told 3 people at that dinner in Tulsa that the patent was worthless. He had told his own assistant not to bother chasing the maintenance fees down. He pulled the file himself for the first time and read, near the bottom of the inventor field, a name he had seen 100 times in family documents and never once connected to anything valuable. Walter J. Krenshaw. He spent 2 days making calls before he drove anywhere. He called the probate attorney, Roy Tilden, who confirmed, in the careful, flat-tone lawyers use when they are about to disappoint a client, that the codicil language was unambiguous, and that the patent had passed to Walter the moment the will was read, regardless of what else the estate documents said. Tilden, who had stayed silent through the entire reading 11 days earlier, did not sound especially surprised by the question, and Dean wondered, briefly and uncomfortably, whether the old lawyer had known something he hadn't bothered to volunteer. He called a contact at Krell who did occasional IP-adjacent commercial work, who told him, off the record, that an active, properly maintained patent with field-proven prior use and a documented paper trail of competitor infringement was the kind of asset that made licensing attorneys interested fast, and that if Dean had told people the patent was worthless, he should probably stop telling people that. By the time Dean got off that second call, he had already started composing, in his head, a version of events where he had simply been hasty, where a reasonable correction was still available, where nothing that mattered had actually been said out loud to anyone who counted. He drove to Pawnee the following Tuesday, alone, in the Lexus his father's estate had given him, the 80-mile drive from Tulsa, taking him past the same flat wheat country he'd grown up looking at from the back seat of his father's truck and had not thought about in years. He parked outside the chain-link fence at Krenshaw Auto and Machine for the first time in his life, in a gravel lot that had been weed-choked and empty 4 months earlier and was now neatly raked. 2 other vehicles already parked at angles that suggested they belonged there. The bay doors were open. The Bridgeport mill was running, a fine curl of steel shavings spinning off the cutter, and Sully Tate was at the lathe with his back to the gate, and Glenn Faskey was bent over the second lathe in the corner with the patient concentration of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be, and Walter Krenshaw was standing at the workbench with a set of calipers in his good hand, measuring a finished collar against a drawing taped to the wall, a drawing with dimensions called out in Walter's own block lettering. Behind him, on a shelf that had been empty 14 months earlier, sat 31 completed torque-limiting adapters arranged in neat rows, each stamped with a serial number, the newest one still warm from the lathe. A hand-lettered sign hung on the wall above the parts counter, fresh paint, Royce Dunnigan's name, and 5 others listed under the header current orders. Dean stood at the gate for a long moment before he said anything. He looked at the running mill, the stacked steel stock, the 2 men working machines that had sat dead for over a year, the shelf of finished parts. The new electrical panel Sully had installed, the order board with 6 names on it, the hand-lettered sign, Krenshaw Auto and Machine, that had been rehung straight this time with new bolts. He looked at all of it the way a man looks at a number he has badly miscalculated, the kind of look that starts in the eyes before it ever reaches the mouth. "You're working," he said finally. "We're working," Walter said, not looking up from the calipers. "I thought the place was condemned. Roof needed patching," Walter said. "Sully and I patched it." Dean's eyes moved to the shelf, to the row of stamped collars, and something in his jaw tightened, a small muscle working once, twice, the same tell Walter remembered from childhood arguments 40 years apart in age, but identical in shape. "What is all this?" Walter set the calipers down and turned to face him directly for the first time. The mill behind him kept running for a moment before Sully, sensing something in the silence, reached over and shut it off, and the bay went quiet, except for the hum of the new electrical panel and, somewhere outside, a meadowlark working through its call. "It's the thing your father left me," Walter said. "Same as it's been the whole time. You just didn't know what you were looking at when you saw it." "Uncle Walt." Dean's voice had lost some of its warmth now, replaced by something thinner, the practiced calm of a man trying to recover ground he could feel sliding. "I need to talk to you about the patent. Figured you might. I didn't know it was active. I didn't know it was." Dean stopped, started again, his hand moving once toward his jacket pocket and then away, as though he'd reached for a phone he decided not to need. "Look, I told some people some things before I'd actually looked into it properly, and I want to be straightforward with you, because I think there might be some real value here, and I think we should talk about how to." "It's not yours to talk about," Walter said. There was no heat in it. He said it the way he diagnosed 10,000 engines, a flat statement of fact, the same voice he used to tell a customer a transmission was beyond saving. "Codicil's clear. Pam Ostrowski's got the paperwork. It's been mine since the day your father's will was read, You just weren't in the room when it mattered. Dean stood very still. Somewhere behind him, the lathe spun down and stopped, and Sully turned around on his stool to watch, and did not say a word, and Glenn Fask, 83 years old, and not a man inclined to involve himself in family business that wasn't his, kept his eyes on his own work and said nothing either, though his hands had gone still on the lathe. I told people at Krell it was nothing, Dean said, more to himself than to Walter, his eyes finding the shelf again, the 31 stamped collars, the order board. I told them I was going to let the maintenance fees lapse. I know, Walter said. Pam mentioned that 2 manufacturers have been waiting on something like this for a few years now. Might have been better for you if you hadn't said it out loud to quite so many people. Dean opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at the shelf of stamped collars again, at the 31 serial numbers, at the sign rehung straight on its bolts, at his uncle standing in a shop he had called a junk pile 12 days after his own father's funeral. A shop that now had a payroll line for Sully and standing orders from a farm equipment dealership and an 83-year-old volunteer running a second lathe because he'd rather be useful than sit alone in his house. I was trying to help you, he said finally. It came out smaller than he meant it to, the certainty gone out of it entirely. I know you believe that, Walter said. I think your father knew what you'd believe too. That's most of why he did it this way. Dean left without saying anything else. He did not slam the gate. He simply walked back to the Lexus, sat in it for a moment without starting the engine, his hands on the wheel, looking once more through the windshield at the bay doors, the running mill now silent. His uncle already turned back to the workbench, already lifting the calipers again, as though Dean had already left the room before he'd actually left it. Then he started the engine and drove back toward Tulsa, the shop growing small in his mirror, the sign, straight now, freshly bolted, red paint touched up by Sully's own hand the week before, visible until the highway curved. Edith had watched the whole exchange from the office doorway, a clipboard with the day's order list still in her hand, and said nothing about it to Walter that evening beyond asking, once, whether he was satisfied with how it had gone. Walter considered the question for a while before answering, the way he considered most things, and said only that satisfied wasn't quite the word for it, that it had simply needed to happen the way it happened, plainly, without anyone raising their voice, and that he supposed that was the only kind of satisfaction this particular situation had ever been going to offer him. Edith decided that was answer enough, and did not ask again. The licensing deal closed 4 months later, with one of the 2 diesel fastener manufacturers Pam Ostrowski had identified, a company out of Indiana that had been quietly infringing the claims language for 3 years without realizing the patent was still active and properly maintained. The negotiation took most of those 4 months, Pam Ostrowski handling it from Oklahoma City while Walter kept the shop running, and it ended not in a courtroom, but in a license agreement that paid a per-unit royalty on every limiter the Indiana company had already sold and would sell going forward, plus a lump settlement for the 3 years of unlicensed use, a number Pam read aloud to Walter and Edith over the kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon in a tone she usually reserved, she admitted, for clients who needed a moment to absorb it. It was not the kind of number that changes a man's life at 71 in the way it might have at 30, but it was enough to fully restore the shop, replace the roof for real this time instead of patching it, buy a CNC lathe that could do in 20 minutes what took Walter and Sully an afternoon by hand, and put $40,000 into a trust for Walter and Edith's grandson, with a note from Walter that the boy could use it for school or for tools, whichever he decided mattered more. Walter also, without telling Edith until after he'd done it, paid off the $380 bearing invoice and the $400 roof patch and every other expense from that first spring exactly as they'd been logged in the ledger, down to the dollar, a settling of accounts that mattered to him for reasons he never fully explained and that Edith never asked him to. Sully took over day-to-day operation of the new line officially, with his name on the second set of papers and Walter's on the first. Krenshaw Auto and Machine reopened to general repair work that fall, 6 days a week, with a hand-lettered addition under the original sign, home of the Krenshaw Torque Limiter, Patent 7XXX. Walter came in most mornings, sat at the same workbench, and trained anyone who asked the way he'd trained 4 apprentices before his hands stopped fully working. Which was, he discovered, almost exactly the same way, since most of what he had to teach had never needed 2 good hands to begin with. Glenn Fask kept coming on Wednesdays, and then on Fridays too, and by November had a key of his own. Dean did not come back to Pawnee. He sent a card at Christmas, the first one in years, which Edith put on the refrigerator without comment, and a brief email in January asking, almost shyly for a man who had once offered to move dead commercial property as easily as breathing, whether Walter might ever want help with the marketing side of things. Should the limiter ever go to wider distribution? Walter read the email twice and did not answer it that week or the next. On a Saturday in late October, 6 months after Dean had stood at the gate, Walter sat on a stool at the workbench with his curled left hand resting flat against the steel surface. Not working, just resting there in the cool autumn light coming through the open bay door, while Edith brought him a thermos of coffee the way she had 1,000 Saturdays before the stroke, and 100 since. She set it down on the bench beside the calipers without a word, the same unhurried economy she'd brought to 46 years of mornings, and stood for a moment in the bay doorway with her arms crossed against the morning chill, watching her husband's hand rest against the steel he'd spent a lifetime learning to read. The Bridgeport mill sat silent, the new CNC lathe beside it, humming through an automated cycle Sully had set running before he left for lunch. The shelf behind Walter held 31 stamped collars in 3 neat rows, the newest still catching the afternoon light along its machined edge, with 6 more already crated for the Stillwater dealership's order. Outside, the hand-painted sign hung straight on its new bolts, the red paint fresh, the words steady against the gray autumn sky, Krenshaw Auto and Machine.